My name is John Todd, and I would like to share with you some of my memories of growing up in Victoria Harbour. There were obvious advantages and disadvantages growing up in a small village. In Victoria Harbour, except for the busy Highway 12 that ran through the village, the other streets had little traffic, which meant safe bicycle riding and ball hockey games. Many stands of trees, including one right behind my house, were excellent places to explore. Today, most are gone and replaced with housing development. The students from Midland schools who would join me in grade 9 were coming from large classes, such as Regent School, which had a graduating class of 35, whereas I was one of 8 graduates from my public school. Not that we received more individualized assistance from our teacher, who was also the principal, but because he had 2 other grades in the classroom, he was too busy. An advantage of a 3-grade classroom was that in grades 6 and 7, one could listen to the lessons of older students and get a basic understanding of the material before reaching that grade. A major disadvantage of the small school without having a gymnasium was that we were not instructed in many sports taught in Midland schools, such as basketball. Midland students also had the opportunity to play basketball at the YMCA. Grade 9 was my introduction to the basics of basketball. It was a short drive to Midland, where we enjoyed many of the same amenities as Midland residents, such as the services of a doctor, dentist, and hospital, stores, and, of course, movies at the Roxy Theatre. Friday night was grocery shopping at Loblaws across from the Roxy, with an ice cream reward for good behavior at the Bowlock, situated on the villa's new site. My family home at 45 Maple Street was located at the steepest point on the street's grade. In the mid-1960s, street improvement resulted in a lessening of the grade and less winter tire spinning for most cars that did not have snow tires. But that did slow down our sleds and go-karts. The gravel street was sprayed with oil in the summer to keep down the dust. In the winter, because the streets were plowed by the only grader in the village, the snow often collected well on the street, which then became icy and perfect for great sledding. Around the age of 3 or 4, I seemed to have the freedom to visit my next-door senior neighbors. Miss McCallum and Miss Massey, who lived next door, always served me excellent cookies. Next door to them was Granny Miller, who made the best homemade bread. My father, a decorated and wounded war veteran, worked a few doors down the street at the broom factory, which is the current site of Shannon's Kitchen, Cafe Bistro, and Bubba's Pizza. During my early years, my mother was a homemaker. She was always quite involved with her Rebecca Lodge and United Church activities, which seemed to involve the baking of many pies. Later, she became one of the village's telephone operators. The broom factory was a framed 2-story building about 100 feet long and covered with tar paper. The building was a great place to play hide and seek with a friend among the barrels of brooms, as long as we didn't make too much noise or get into trouble. On the main floor, the corn was sorted and cut evenly with a very large, sharp, and scary blade that worked like a paper cutter. My father's job was attaching the corn, which was a coarse grass. Each broom was made by attaching the corn to a handle with wire. After Ken Webb stitched each broom with string on the belt-driven stitcher, the brooms were dipped into a vat of stain and dried. Each broom was combed by a large spinning motorized wire brush to remove any loose strands and corn seeds. From this station, each broom was then lifted up through a hole in the ceiling where stickers were attached to the handles. There were so many different designed stickers. I always wondered why there were so many labels when all the brooms seemed to be made the same. But there must have been a difference I didn't understand at the time. As a young boy, I loved exploring around the small pond at the back of the vacant property beside our house. When called for lunch, I still remember looking back across our vacant lot to the house and thinking, what a long way home, and how long and tired I was walking back. For a few years, our vacant lot seemed to be the meeting place in the neighborhood for baseball and football games. The property line between the lot and the vacant property was a tangle of long grass, weeds, and rocks, which seemed to be the perfect home for garter snakes. I never liked snakes, and when a foul ball was hit into the vacant property, I always seemed to be the one chosen to retrieve the ball. Remember Indiana Jones' feeling about snakes? Soon we outgrew that small lot, which was only 100 feet deep, and moved down the street to the Dunlop property across from Shannon's. This field was much larger and had no snakes. The field worked well until one of my friends solidly hit a long fly ball that ricocheted off a driver's door of a car parked in front of the broom factory. That was the last of our baseball games there, since we knew we had graduated to the village's baseball field at the intersection of Richard and Jepson Streets. We were fortunate that a few of the parents organized a few baseball teams that could play against each other. In those days, the backstop was near the highway. Yes, Highway 12, which is today Park Street, Richard Street, Albert Street, and William Street. In recent years, the orientation of the field was turned 180 degrees. A favorite memory is when one of the boys stood in the batter's box arguing with the umpire, who was his father, about a call. The game continued since he was in the box, and due to his arguing, he didn't realize the game was continuing and he was called out on strikes. Playing left field, I often had to cross Jepson Street and into the cemetery to retrieve foul balls. The Dunlop property also had a large sandy area immediately across from Shannon's. One day, we boys were pirates, and using a pickaxe and shovels, dug a large hole and buried a picnic basket. I don't think there was anything special inside the box. Once buried, I guess we thought we should remove the basket and put it back. As some of the sand was removed, I could see the handle, and at the same moment as I reached down came the pickaxe on the back of my skull. Boy, did the blood flow. By the time I ran across the road to my father at the broom factory, I was drenched in blood. I was taken to old Doc Mackenzie, who lived at the corner of Richard and Ellen, who stitched me up. I was very lucky to only end up with a headache. At 5, I began grade 1 at the old 2-story brick schoolhouse that once stood on William Street. Our primary classroom, grades 1, 2, and 3, was at the back of the building, separated from the rest of the building by a large auditorium where the boys and girls' washrooms were under the stage in the basement. Often, we would be easily distracted on our walk and would need to run very quickly when we heard the large bell in the school tower tolling its morning call to class. For years, the bells had seemingly disappeared. A number of years ago, it was tracked down in a field, restored, and now sits proudly in the Tay Shores Public School. Starting in grade 4, our room was at the front of the school. The school was showing its age by now, and no one was allowed to go upstairs. If we had been caught up there, we would have been strapped. At that time, the principal seemed to use the strap a great deal. I felt sorry for a friend of mine who came from a poor family and seemed to get strapped quite often. In the early 1960s, the space race between the United States and Russia was big news. Each time there was a rocket launch, our class was taken next door into the intermediate room, and both classes watched the launch on a small black and white television. Teaching at Parkview, several classes often assembled in the hall and watched the space shuttle launches. Fortunately, for some reason, we had not assembled the students the day of the Challenger launch. A favorite recess activity at the old school was climbing on and around a line of boulders behind the school near the tree line. Of course, we were always getting told to stay away, but in a few days we would be back again playing in the boulders. Only once did we ever go farther back past the boulders, through a small stand of trees, into the clearing above the train tracks and watch a train pass. I believe the conductor notified the school and we got into a lot of trouble. Our music teacher, Mrs. Self, who visited our school once a week, surprised us one day when I was in grade 4 and brought her reel-to-reel tape recorder. This was the first time I had ever seen this type of technology. By grade 4, having mastered riding a bicycle, a new route to school had been discovered. Leaving Maple Street, just a few doors up from my house, we entered the old road allowance, now the entrance to the new seniors' residence, and rode our bikes along a bush trail that paralleled the street, avoiding the protruding rocks. As the trail began slowly veering to the right and coming to a Y, we followed the left trail that soon took us to two small dips in the trail that, after a rain, were wet and muddy, causing us to walk our bikes through the long grass and gads, avoiding this muddy area. Back on the flat and dry trail, within seconds, we entered the small reforested area called the Pines. The pine trees had been planted many years before by school children, including my mother. Leaving the Pines, we cycled through a small field where the new 4-room public school was being built. When the trail stopped at Jepson Street, we slowly biked down Martha to Richard Street, which at that time was Highway 12. After crossing the street, we biked up past the Dutch Grill and Supertest service station on the corner, site of today's car wash, sometimes cutting between the gas pumps and the building, and turned onto Albert. Passing the telephone exchange and Ball's drugstore, we turned left at the bank corner onto William Street, and passing Eplett's Hardware and Reed's General Store, we rode to the school. On our bicycle ride home from school, we often stopped at Ball's drugstore to pick up some sponge toffee or a pack of hockey or baseball cards, each costing a nickel. At the time, we had no idea how much those cards would eventually be worth. Before heading home with my new cards, I often stopped off at the telephone exchange in the new building that was built next to today's Bayport Masonic Hall. The telephone exchange on the left and the OPP station on the right had shared the main floor of the 2-story building that is now Bayport Masonic Hall. My mother, in the foreground, and the other operators, such as her aunt Laura Belfry and supervisor Ina Lidstone, knew everyone's names and telephone numbers. Our telephone number was 78. I enjoyed watching as she made a connection with 2 corded plugs and then pulled a small toggle switch to activate the ringer. On the other side of the Masonic Hall was a Supertest gas station, and it was always interesting to watch the gas being pumped. Next to the station was the Dutch Grill, a small restaurant that seemed to be a favorite spot of teenagers. The air smelled like French fries, and the music was loud, as I remember from the odd time I was there as a young nervous boy amongst all the much larger teenagers. Biking to school and leaving the stand of Pines one day into the field before we reached Jepson Street, I saw a large hole being dug and soon found out that a new school was soon going to be built there. Imagine our surprise and happiness knowing that the school would only now be a few minutes from home. On a daily basis, we watched the creation of the new 4-room school. Yes, 4 rooms. A primary room, grades 1 to 3, a junior room, 4 and 5, and an intermediate room, grades 6 to 8, and taught by the principal, Clarence Moore. The 4th room was a utility room where we had our music lessons. Between the utility room and the junior room, shown in the photo on the left, was a movable wall. When slid in a track down the hall toward the Pines, the larger room became a small auditorium for special occasions like graduations. In my neighborhood, we bought our essentials like pop, chocolate bars, gum, comic books at Cliff Moore's Esso, located approximately halfway between today's Bubba's Pizza and Oakwood Park Community Center. It was always bittersweet when the new comic books arrived. Exciting to see all the new titles, but a little sad knowing our limited finances could only buy a few at a time. Maple Street, with its steep grade, was a favorite gathering point for the neighborhood friends with their homemade go-karts in the summer and their sleds with the metal runners similar to this photo in the winter. At least 8 to 10 would line up side by side at the start of a race. At the opening of the road allowance, which is the site of today's entrance into the seniors' apartment building. Incidentally, this is where there was a street light, which made for excellent night riding. With a friend's hearty push, the go-kart or sled would gain speed with the goal of going the farthest down the street toward the highway, which is today's Park Street. I don't know if any go-karts were equipped with brakes. Mine wasn't. If a car turned onto Maple from the highway, a quick decision had to be made. The decision during the winter was easy. Just head for the snowbank. During the summer, it was tricky to stay close to the edge of the street without careening into the ditch and wiping out. Getting a haircut was always an interesting experience. It wasn't so much the actual haircut, but the building. At my age, how would I have known that Bill Quinlan's barbershop, located next to today's Cenotaph, had been a 3-story wet hotel called the Queen's. Wet refers to the fact that the only legal drinking in the village was at this hotel. While the front room was the barbershop, at the back was an age-restricted pool hall. I always wondered about the large wooden propeller above the doorway going into the pool hall. Years later, I would learn that Bill had been a sergeant in the RCF during the war. When I was a small boy, dipping my fishing line off the town dock at the foot of Albert Street, occasionally I would be amazed when my hook would snag a thin slab of wood with the bark still attached. I would think, where did this wood come from? What a mystery. Years later, I would learn that I had been fishing right on the site of the middle lumber mill of 3 that belonged to the Victoria Harbour Lumber Company. On the site of today's library and post office stood the Royal Victoria Hotel, built by the Victoria Harbour Lumber Company. In 1902, just as the hotel and the company offices across Albert Street, on the site of today's LCBO, were nearing completion, a fire broke out in the hotel's furnace room and both buildings were destroyed. With building crews working 6 days a week, the 2 structures were rebuilt in months. In 1958, the company office building, abandoned for some time, was demolished in a controlled fire by the village firefighters. A few years later, in 1961, a fire broke out in the middle of the night and destroyed the Royal Victoria Hotel. In time, a small mall was built in its place that housed Theo Bernard's IGA and the current post office, after it had been moved from a building that once stood on the current parking lot of the Sunny Convenience Store. The post office ran for years by Postmaster Philip Morrow, and it was a renovated main floor of what had been Rumble's hardware store, The facade of the building looked very much the same as today's Village Mercantile. Unfortunately, in 1912, most of that building and the top floors of today's Sunny Convenient and the building around the corner caught on fire. The main floor of the buildings along Albert Street were saved and renovated. In later years, this was the home of Lauren Ball's drugstore and the Bank of Commerce on the corner. Around the corner, a popular place in 1912, the Gem Theater, with apartments above, had been completely destroyed in the fire. I believe it was in the 1970s, long after the post office had moved to its current location, that this building too was destroyed by fire. The vacant lot eventually became the parking lot. Back in yesteryear, the present site of Oakwood Community Center was a stand of oak trees. Between the trees and the highway, where the present sidewalk is now located, was a very deep ditch, about 4 or 5 feet deep. Riding a bike along that stretch of highway was very dangerous, since each time a car came by, the cyclist was forced from the pavement into the loose sandy shoulder with the potential to be thrown into the deep ditch. Cycling around the village and along the shoreline streets often led to a pit stop at Mackenzie's Dairy, where a 500 milliliter carton of chocolate milk cost 50 cents. Interesting, today that is roughly still the cost of a 500 milliliter carton. Too bad that chocolate bars today don't cost 10 cents like they did back in those days, or a comic book for 12 cents. In 1962, I began grade 6 in a brand new school, today's Tay Shores, and around the same time began a newspaper route 6 days a week. My papers were dropped off in front of Billy Moore's hardware store, site of today's Cenotaph, and shown here circa 1960. I walked around most of the village delivering my 22 newspapers and earned 2 cents per paper. Every other Friday was collection day, when hopefully all the customers were home to pay me. One rainy day at the corner of Maple and Albert, I learned a very important lesson in trust. From that corner, I had one customer who lived at the end of Bay Street. I was tired and soaking wet. I thought, that's a long way to deliver one newspaper in this weather. So I asked 2 younger boys standing nearby if they would deliver the paper for me. They seemed quite excited to oblige. A while later, while at home warming up, the phone rang and a very upset customer who lived on Bay Street was asking why his paper had not been delivered. It turned out that shortly after I left the paper with the boys, they had pulled it all apart and the wet pages were strewn all around the street. On a dark and rainy night, I had to clean up the mess, buy a paper at a store, and then deliver it to my customer. Lesson learned? Want a job done? Do it yourself. Over the years, that little 4-room school has gone through a number of renovations. At a Tay Shores open house, I noticed that the laminated wood beams that were in my grade 6, 7, 8 classroom were still there. Today, that is the site of the main office and principal's office. Outside what was my classroom windows, where I would sometimes daydream or think of answers, today is a hallway. During my final high school years and during my university years, during the summers, I worked at Bruce Eplett's hardware store, site of today's Village Mercantile. I performed a wide variety of duties, from cutting and threading pipe, mixing paint, cutting keys, and even filling empty alcohol bottles with Varsol with a hand pump. Bruce and his son Jim had different styles with regards to a customer. Bruce would instruct me to meet the customer and ask how I could help. Jim would instruct me to pause and allow the customer some time to look around. I did as instructed when each was looking after the store, but at times I wasn't sure what to do when they were both in the store at the same time. The red building across Albert Street from the hardware store was originally a library built for the residents by the lumber company on the condition that the residents would vote to keep the village alcohol-free. Later, the main floor served two functions. Walking up a short flight of interior stairs, on the left, residents could pay their bills, while on the right was a small library. While I never used that library, I did learn the classics through comic books. During the hot summer nights, I was allowed to sleep in our front enclosed porch. My elderly neighbor down the street, I found, had stacks of old comics, including many classic illustrated that his children had collected. He allowed me to take armfuls of comics home to read if I promised to be careful with them and return them, which I did. I remember staying up into the wee hours reading and enjoying them, and sometimes being disturbed by the content, especially the story Green Mansions. After graduating grade 8, I attended Midland Secondary School on a split schedule. As Penetanguishene Secondary School was still under construction, MSS students attended from 8 in the morning until 1 o'clock, and the PSS students attended from 1 o'clock until 6. I can still remember the sense of joy and freedom stepping off the school bus at the foot of Maple Street around 1:20, knowing I had a free afternoon. After graduation from high school, I attended and received my Bachelor of Arts in Geography at the University of Guelph and my Bachelor of Education at Queen's University. I spent half my teaching career in Midland at Huron Park and Parkview, and the second half in Penetanguishene at James Keating Elementary. During my university years, the little 4-room school had grown a wing of several classrooms. After I was hired by the school board, my first assignment was going to be teaching the grade 8 class at the school. But during the summer, plans changed and I began teaching at Huron Park in Midland. In 1976, soon after my teaching career began, and I had a few dollars now in my pocket, a photograph in the Midland Free Press sparked my desire to research local history and collect vintage photographs. In a photograph of Albert Street looking toward Hog Bay was a small mill burner that was incorrectly labeled as a barn silo. My quest for knowledge began as I visited seniors in the village and learned about the village history and borrowed vintage photographs from them to copy for my growing collection. Building a collection of vintage photographs was very expensive at that time. The cost to have an 8x10 black and white photograph copied was $10. The village Lackac, the forerunner of Tay Heritage, had recently been created. Soon, life and responsibilities of a teaching career began to take most of my time, and the photo collection sat patiently in a filing cabinet drawer for several years. I had a large photo collection with memories and historical information swirling in my head, and when the internet, especially Facebook, became popular, and by now I was retired, I had the means and the time to continue researching and sharing my information. From 2013, I have been the administrator of the Facebook group Huronia's Past and Present, a group dedicated to the history and heritage of our area. Since 2019, I have also been involved with SS Keewatin for her last few years in Port Minico as the archivist, organizing and digitizing vintage photos and documents. Being a member of Tay Heritage for the last 8 years and a member of the Cultural Alliance Heritage Subcommittee for over 5 years have been rewarding experiences and provided me more opportunities to share my photos and knowledge. The history and heritage of our area have played major roles in my life, and I'm glad that you have had the opportunity to walk with me down my little memory lane.